At dawn on February 12, 1944, a pale sun struggled to break through the smoke and frost that hung over the Eiffel forests. Deep within enemy territory, a U.S. Army convoy lay shattered along a frozen road near Prum. The air smelled of cordite and burnt rubber. Twisted vehicles hissed with steam. In the chaos, Private First Class Robert Bobby Keane of the 28th Infantry Division was dragged from the wreckage by German soldiers, his face bloodied, his helmet missing. The war had swallowed him whole. In the days that followed, he would vanish into the labyrinth of Germany's prisoner camps, his name reduced to a number stamped on a dog tag. Somewhere across the Atlantic, his mother, Margaret Keane of Springfield, Illinois, sat by a radio, hands trembling as she turned the dial, praying for static to turn into a voice. The winter of 1944 was cruel to prisoners of war. The Stalag system stretched across occupied Europe like a dark network of despair. American, British, and Soviet captives were packed into wooden barracks, their breath freezing into frost along the beams. German guards called it Ordnung, order, but it was order born of starvation and fear. Bobby, barely 20, endured endless roll calls and thin soup ladled from blackened pots. He wrote in tiny script on scraps of Red Cross stationery, careful to sound alive for his mother's sake. The censors read every word before it left the camp. He didn't know that one letter, sent from a small wooden table in Illinois, would change everything. Margaret had been a nurse in the Great War. She knew the anatomy of wounds. But nothing prepared her for the wound of uncertainty. Every morning she walked to the post office in her gray wool coat, the hem darkened by slush, asking the same question. "Any word from my boy?" Most days, the clerk just shook his head. But Margaret was not the kind of woman who surrendered to silence. She began writing letters, not just to her son, but to anyone who could listen, the War Department, the International Red Cross, and finally, in a stroke of desperate boldness, directly to the German command in Geneva. Her words were simple and unadorned, but they carried something stronger than protocol. The unwavering voice of a mother demanding mercy. In that same month, thousands of mothers wrote similar letters. But Margaret's carried a detail that made it stand out. A line about her late husband, a decorated German-American veteran of the 1918 Meuse-Argonne offensive. Somewhere in the German bureaucracy, that detail landed on the desk of an officer who remembered the name. Captain Wilhelm Hartmann, a Wehrmacht liaison to the Red Cross, had studied in Chicago before the war. He paused when he saw the letter, its ink faded, its tone almost formal. "My husband once fought alongside men who are now your enemies," Margaret had written. "He taught me to believe that soldiers, whatever their flag, share the same pain when far from home." Hartmann set the letter aside but couldn't forget it. Back in the camp, Bobby had been transferred to Stalag 9B, one of the harshest in Germany. Prisoners there survived on 800 calories a day, their boots falling apart, their minds blurring between hunger and frostbite. The guards barked commands. The snow fell without end. Nights were the worst, when the wind crept under the boards and carried whispers of liberation from distant fronts. On March 3rd, a Red Cross delegation visited. The guards lined the men up like broken statues. As the inspection ended, a German officer called Bobby's name. He froze. No one was ever called by name unless it meant punishment. But instead of the usual shouts, the officer handed him a sealed envelope stamped with a crimson eagle. Inside, a short message in formal German. "By order of the High Command, Private First Class Robert Keane is to be transferred for humanitarian reasons." The officer smirked. "Your mother must write fine letters." Margaret had unknowingly triggered a chain of events that rippled through layers of bureaucracy. Hartmann, moved by her plea, had sent her letter through unofficial channels, attaching it to a report on prisoner conditions for American nationals of German descent. The tone of her writing, respectful yet imploring, had reached someone in Berlin who, for reasons lost to history, signed an approval for individual relocation. Perhaps it was paperwork mistaken for propaganda, or perhaps a quiet act of defiance in a system collapsing under its own cruelty. Whatever the reason, it placed Bobby on a truck bound not for a labor camp, but for Stalag Luft 3, a camp run by the Luftwaffe, where conditions were marginally better and escape attempts were sometimes overlooked with weary indifference. That night, as Bobby sat in the back of the truck, wrapped in a tattered blanket. He watched the German countryside slide by, burned barns, leafless trees, distant fires. He clutched the letter like a relic. It was not just a message from home. It was proof that he had not been forgotten. The sound of the engine mixed with the faint echo of Allied bombers far above, invisible ghosts in the night sky. He wondered if one of them carried a message for him too. When the convoy stopped near Sagan, a guard pointed to the horizon. "If you ever get out," he said in broken English, "remember who sent the letter." Bobby nodded, though he didn't yet understand what that meant. Back in Illinois, Margaret received a telegram weeks later. It was brief. "Your son transferred to Luftwaffe jurisdiction. Reported in good condition." She sank into her chair, tears streaking her face. Neighbors said later she walked to church that evening without her coat, clutching the telegram in both hands. The organ played softly, and she whispered the same prayer she'd written so many times before. "Keep him safe, just until it's over." By April, the Allied advance had reached the Rhine. The skies were black with smoke. Trains carrying prisoners westward became targets themselves. In Luft 3, Bobby heard the distant rumble of artillery, the war closing in. But unlike the hollow despair that had filled the earlier months, a strange hope took root among the prisoners. Some spoke of miraculous letters, others of German officers quietly disobeying brutal orders. Rumors spread that entire camps were being abandoned ahead of the advancing Americans. For Bobby, every rumor was a heartbeat closer to home. What no one yet realized was that Margaret's letter, copied and circulated by Red Cross intermediaries, had reached more desks than anyone intended. It would become an unofficial example cited in discussions of humane correspondence within the Geneva liaison offices. A mother's plea had crossed enemy lines more effectively than any coded transmission. Her words, simple, human, and stubbornly hopeful, had slipped through the machinery of war like light through cracked armor. And as the front lines drew near, one question began to hang in the cold spring air. Would that letter's mercy hold? Or would the chaos of retreat swallow its promise whole? When the first Allied shells fell near Sagan in late April 1945, the guards at Stalag Luft 3 were already burning documents. The smoke rose in thin, frantic pillars, carrying with it names, numbers, and the final evidence of lives interrupted. Bobby Keene stood among hundreds of prisoners gathered in the yard, their faces gaunt but their eyes fixed on the horizon. The air trembled with the sound of artillery. The war was ending, but endings in war were never clean. Across the camp's barbed perimeter, German officers argued, their voices sharp, the edges of their composure fraying. Some spoke of surrender. Others still clung to orders that no longer mattered. Within that confusion, a name surfaced again, Keene, the young American who had been transferred by letter, somewhere in the camp records. His mother's words still rested like an ember that refused to die dawn on April 28th. The prisoners were marched out under gray skies, their breath misting like ghosts. Bobby carried a small satchel of Red Cross rations, biscuits, powdered milk, and a dented can of meat. The guards drove them westward, desperate to stay ahead of the Soviet advance. What followed was one of the countless forced marches of that final spring. Hundreds of men trudging through mud and frost, their boots dissolving, their hopes tied to rumors of liberation. Some collapsed. Others disappeared into the woods. Bobby walked in silence, holding on to one thought, that somewhere across the ocean, his mother might still be writing letters. The column stretched for miles when a strange thing happened. Near a small crossroads south of Munich, a convoy of German trucks appeared, waving a white flag marked with a red cross. Inside were crates labeled humanitarian relief. The officer leading the POW march hesitated, unsure if it was a trap. But among the convoy was a man wearing the insignia of the Red Cross Liaison Office. His papers bore the signature of Captain Hartmann, the same name that had moved Margaret's letter months earlier. He produced an authorization for the transfer of sick and protected persons, including Americans held under Luftwaffe jurisdiction. By some twist of bureaucracy or conscience, Bobby's name was again on the list. The officer in charge shrugged, muttered something about orders from Berlin, and handed him over. For the first time in months, Bobby was placed inside a vehicle instead of walking behind one. He stared out the window as the countryside rolled past, villages in ruins, fields scarred with bomb craters, Bridges collapsed into rivers. Somewhere above, Allied thunderbolts roared, hunting the last convoys still moving. The German driver kept glancing at the sky, muttering prayers. Bobby sat beside a Swiss Red Cross delegate who spoke softly in French, explaining that the prisoners were being handed over to American forces near Moosburg. The delegate carried a satchel of documents marked Geneva. Among them, Bobby noticed a familiar handwriting. His mother's letter had been copied again. Its translation included in a diplomatic packet summarizing civilian correspondence influencing humanitarian transfer. It had become more than a mother's plea. It was now, unknowingly, a precedent. They reached Moosburg on April 29th, just hours before the 14th Armored Division stormed the area. The guards fled as American tanks broke through the eastern road, their treads crushing wire and debris. Soldiers swarmed the camp gates, shouting orders and disbelief. Many of the prisoners wept openly. Some simply stood still, unable to process the sound of freedom. Bobby, too weak to stand, was carried by medics to a field tent marked with a white star. Inside, a lieutenant asked for his name, his unit, and his hometown. When he said Springfield, Illinois, the officer smiled. "You're going home, son." Across the ocean, in that same Illinois town, Margaret woke to the sound of church bells announcing Germany's collapse. The local paper carried a headline she could barely believe: POWs liberated near Munich. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph of her son taken before he shipped out. His face was still boyish, his uniform too large. She didn't know that at that very hour, he was aboard a truck heading toward a U.S. evacuation hospital near Reims, France. The doctor who treated him noted his frostbite and malnutrition, but wrote, "Patient in stable condition, spirits remarkable." In those hospitals, nurses kept hearing stories about a letter. Dozens of POWs spoke of an American mother whose words had somehow saved one of their own. The rumor grew with each retelling. Some claimed it had reached Berlin itself. Others believed it was carried by a sympathetic German officer who defied orders. No one knew the truth, yet the myth gave comfort, a small miracle amid the ruin. Bobby, when asked, only said, "My mother never stopped writing." He couldn't explain the chain of coincidences that had spared him when thousands perished on those same marches. Perhaps it was timing. Perhaps humanity is slipping through cracks in the system. Or perhaps it was faith, written in ink and mailed across a war. After the German surrender on May 7th, the U.S. Army compiled thousands of prisoner testimonies. Among them was Bobby's brief statement, released near Moosburg. "Believe a letter from home aided my transfer." His report was filed under individual cases of repatriation, civilian influence. It was forwarded to the Red Cross archives in Geneva, where Captain Hartmann's name appeared again, this time with a note of commendation for facilitating humanitarian correspondence. Historians later found his signature in the margins of dozens of other transfers approved in the same month. Whether he acted out of guilt or conscience remains unknown. But Margaret's letter had clearly opened a door in early June 1945. The transport ship USS Joseph T. Dickman docked in New York Harbor, its decks crowded with returning soldiers. Reporters lined the piers. Bands played. Flags waved in the humid wind. Among the men walking down the gangway, one limped slightly, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. He looked older than 21. In his breast pocket was the same letter, worn soft at the edges, its words fading but legible. "Come home safe, Bobby. Come home proud." The reunion was quiet. No cameras, no speeches. Margaret met him at the station, her hands trembling as she touched his face, half afraid he would vanish again. They didn't speak much that day. They didn't need to. A single letter had carried more meaning than 1,000 words could hold. In the months that followed, she received visitors, neighbors, church women, even a local reporter, asking about the letter that had saved her son. She always smiled faintly and said, "I just wrote what any mother would." But history would not forget so easily. Her letter was cited in a 1946 War Department memorandum titled "Civilian Communications and Morale Effects." It recommended the creation of structured channels allowing families to contact POWs more directly, a small reform born from one mother's persistence. The memo's final line read, "Emotional correspondence, when received, may reinforce humanitarian behavior even in enemy ranks." And yet, within that bureaucratic phrasing, something deeper lingered, the unseen weight of mercy that could exist even between enemies. For all the steel and firepower that defined the war, it had been ink and paper, courage and love that had changed the fate of one man. But the story wasn't finished. For while Bobby had escaped the camps, another, darker discovery awaited him in post-war Europe, one that would force him to confront the legacy of the man who'd carried his mother's words across enemy lines. The summer of 1946 brought Europe a fragile peace, a silence heavy with ghosts. Cities still smoldered beneath their ruins, and trains clattered again across bridges that had been rebuilt from twisted iron. In that uneasy calm, Sergeant Robert Keane, now 22, found himself back on the continent he'd nearly died upon. The Army had asked for volunteers to assist in post-war repatriation efforts, identifying graves, documenting missing men, and interviewing former German officers for the War Crimes Commission. Most soldiers refused to return, but Bobby agreed. He said it was unfinished business. In truth, he wanted to find one name, Captain Wilhelm Hartmann, the man whose unseen hand had carried his mother's letter through the chaos of a collapsing Reich. Berlin was a wasteland of shattered stone and hollow windows. When Bobby arrived in June, the smell of burned paper lingered in the air, mingling with cold dust and the faint sweetness of overgrown weeds pushing through rubble. Soviet guards watched him suspiciously as he entered the Allied liaison compound near Potsdamer Platz. Files were stacked like tombstones, lists of the dead, missing, and conditionally cleared personnel. For days, he sifted through names, dates, and signatures until he found it. Hartmann, Wilhelm, Oberleutnant, Wehrmacht liaison to the Swiss Red Cross. Captured April 30th, 1945, near Rosenheim. Status: detained. Bobby stared at the page. The man was alive that he requested an interview. The British officer in charge hesitated. He's been cooperative, but he's not exactly proud of what he did. Still, they granted permission. On July 3rd, in a former Luftwaffe barracks converted to a detention facility, Bobby entered a dim cell where the German officer sat behind a wooden table. Hartmann looked older than his years, thin, hollow-eyed, his uniform replaced by gray prison clothes. When Bobby introduced himself, the German's gaze sharpened. "Keane," he said softly, his accent thick. "Yes, I remember that name." For a moment, the war seemed to evaporate. Two men, once enemies, faced each other in the ruins of the world they had both survived. Hartmann explained quietly that he had received Margaret's letter through the Geneva office in early 1944. "I do not know why I acted," he admitted. "Perhaps because it was written with dignity. No anger, no demand for revenge. Only love." He paused, searching for the right English word. "It reminded me that my own mother used to write me the same way, before she was killed in a bombing raid." Bobby said nothing. The silence between them carried the weight of 2 generations of grief. Hartmann went on to describe how he had attached Margaret's letter to a humanitarian report, bypassing formal channels. He never expected it to reach Berlin. But once it did, it was read by an adjutant who had lost his own son on the Eastern Front. He signed it immediately. That single act of empathy, passed like a spark between strangers, had cut through the machinery of cruelty. "It was not courage," Hartmann said quietly. "It was fatigue. I was tired of orders that killed for no reason." Bobby later recorded the interview in his report. Subject exhibits remorse and clarity. Aware of consequences of defiance. Attributes action to personal conscience rather than ideology. When he closed the file, he asked Hartmann one last question. "Why didn't you leave Germany when you had the chance?" The German smiled faintly. "Because someone had to stay and tell the truth." Weeks later, Bobby returned to the United States. He brought with him a copy of his mother's original letter, now preserved in the Red Cross archives, and a small notebook filled with Hartmann's words. He married a nurse named Ellen in 1948, became a teacher, and rarely spoke of the war again. But every December, on the anniversary of his capture, he placed a single envelope on his mantelpiece, addressed to Geneva, as a quiet gesture of gratitude. He never mailed it. Margaret lived long enough to see her son raise a family. In her final years, she kept the faded telegram and a clipping from the War Department memorandum in a small wooden box. When she passed in 1957, Bobby found a note inside that read, "War is made of orders. Peace is made of letters." He would later quote those words at a veterans memorial service. His voice steady, his uniform pressed, the crowd silent beneath the flag's slow rippled eye. In 1962, the Red Cross declassified its wartime archives. Among thousands of documents was Margaret Keene's original plea, still bearing the crease marks of its journey. It was displayed in Geneva for a brief exhibition titled Letters of Compassion in Time of War. Visitors read her handwriting, the uneven, trembling strokes of a mother who had refused to surrender to silence. One journalist from Le Monde described it as a letter that carried the weight of the human soul through barbed wire. Historians noted that her correspondence influenced the drafting of Article 71 in the 1949 Geneva Convention, ensuring families could communicate with prisoners of war without interference. A single page from Illinois had helped write the rules of mercy. Meanwhile, in a small village outside Munich, an elderly man named Hartmann lived out his final years quietly, tending a garden where apple trees grew over what had once been a bomb crater. In 1973, he wrote a letter addressed to the Keene family. "Your mother's courage reminded me that humanity can survive even when nations cannot. I never forgot her words." Bobby received it weeks later, long after Margaret's death. He kept it folded beside hers, two letters that had crossed a century of war and forgiveness. When Bobby died in 1984, his daughter found those letters preserved together, bound by a ribbon faded to the color of old blood. She donated them to the Smithsonian's Voices of War collection, where they rest today under dim archival light. Visitors pass by the display, often unaware that they are looking at the tangible proof of something rare, a moment when empathy breached the front lines. The story of that letter has since been retold in classrooms, documentaries, and museums. Each time, the same truth resurfaces, that the machinery of war, its steel, its fire, its endless logic of destruction, can sometimes be undone by something as fragile as a mother's handwriting. The engineers and generals built weapons to dominate oceans and skies, yet it was ordinary civilians, nurses, radio clerks, and postal workers who carried the messages that preserved humanity amid the inferno. In the end, the letter that saved one American soldier did more than spare a life. It reminded the world that even in total war, decency can endure if someone dares to write it into existence. A single sheet of paper had traveled from a kitchen table in Illinois to the corridors of power in Berlin, and from there into history itself. And as veterans of that war faded into silence, one phrase from Margaret's final note lived on, a quiet testament whispered across generations. In every war, there are still hearts that choose to reach instead of hate.